The last wagon rolled out through the Falomir gate an hour before the sun, and Wenna stood in the door of the great granary and listened to the silence it left behind. The barn had been raised to hold the harvest of 40 farms. Now her lantern found only bare boards, a drift of chaff banked in the corners, and the long empty bins where a year's bread had stood a week before. The Duke's men had been thorough. They had carried off even the seed corn, the one thing a dying holding is never stripped of, because seed corn is next year, and Falomir, the wagon said as plainly as words, was to have no next year. Fixed to the door of the emptied bin was a single folded paper heavy with the green seal of the Duke of Harrogate. She had read it twice by candlelight and did not need to read it again. In a clerk's tidy hand it set down that the holding of Falomir, its drowned fields, its fallen barns, its handful of remaining souls, passed into her sole keeping to answer for its own debts at the turning of the year. It was not a gift. Every soul in the yard understood that. A gift did not come with its granaries scraped down to the wood. Behind her, the servants not yet dismissed had gathered under the eaves to watch her read, the way people gather at a riverbank to watch a thing go under. She felt their eyes on the back of her neck. Some were pitying. Some were already counting the weeks until she failed, and they were free to leave. Wenna folded the paper small and slipped it into her apron. Then she took up her lantern and walked out to look at the fields she had been given to die on. Of everything the Duke had judged worthless enough to leave behind at Falomir, the greatest by far was the horse. They called him Bracken, for the rough gray of his coat, the color of dead fern on a winter moor. He stood a full hand taller than any working horse Wenna had seen, bred for the plow and grown into something the estate could neither use nor sell. He had thrown every man who tried to back him, and left more than one groom shaken and unwilling to try again, until the Duke's own dealer looked the stallion over, shook his head, and named a price so low it was an insult. So Bracken stayed, a great, dangerous, useless creature eating hay no one could spare, penned behind a double rail at the far end of the yard, where the last of the hands pitched his feed over the fence and did not linger. He was feared the way weather is feared. The children of the remaining cottagers were forbidden the lower yard. The men half-crossed themselves when he screamed in the night, and he screamed often, a high, furious, grieving sound that carried across the flooded fields and set every dog for a mile to howling. Everyone feared him. That was the trouble. Everyone but Wenna. She had not sought him out. She had no more business with a plow stallion than with the drowned ground he was bred to break. But on her third morning at Falomir, crossing the yard before light as was already her habit, she stopped at the double rail without meaning to, and the great gray head came down out of the dark and rested for one impossible moment against her shoulder. She did not move. She did not speak. She felt the enormous warmth of him, the damp breath, the tremor that ran through him like a struck bell, and she understood what the wildness and the screaming had hidden from everyone else. The horse was not vicious. He was frightened, and he was alone, and he had been alone a very long time. After that he watched for her. When she crossed the yard he left his hay and paced the rail to keep her in sight. When she knelt at the flood ditches with her sleeves rolled, measuring the standing water, he would come to the nearest fence and grow still, as though her stillness were a thing he could borrow. He asked nothing of her, no sugar, no soft word. He simply attended her, an immense gray presence at the edge of whatever she did. And where he attended, the others kept their distance, so that she was left blessedly alone to think. Not everyone counted that a blessing. You'll keep clear of that animal. The bailiff set it on her 4th day, planted in her path with his ledger beneath his arm and his narrow face pinched against the cold. Craik was a spare, gray man who had served the Duke's steward 20 years, and who now, with the steward gone, ran what was left of Falomir as though it were still worth running, and as though she were a tenant to be managed rather than the woman whose name was on the Duke's own decree. That animal is dangerous, and one day there will be an accident. When there is, it will be laid at your door, and his grace will have the excuse he wants to be rid of the pair of you." "He comes to me," Wenna said. "I do not go to him." "Then see that he stops." Crake's eyes were the flat gray of pond ice. "There is no place at Falomir for a woman who plays at charming beasts. There is barely a place for one who can keep the accounts." He laid 2 fingers on the ledger as he said it, the way another man might touch a weapon. Wenna inclined her head and said nothing, because saying nothing was the surest thing she owned. But she watched him walk away, and she thought, this is a man who counts everything. He would count the grains in the empty bins, if any were left. Sooner or later he would count the mornings she spent at the flood ditches, and begin to wonder what a keeper of dead land finds to measure there so carefully day after day. And that was the one thing at Falomir she could not afford for any man to count. Her name was not simply Wenna, keeper of Falomir. It was Wenna Sennen, and there were men still living who would have paid a great deal to learn she was breathing. 14 years before, her mother had been the most talked-of woman in the North Country. Oriel Sennen had been born a ditcher's daughter and had made herself, by nothing but hard reading and harder watching, into a steward of land such as the great estates had never thought to employ. She understood water. She understood how a drowned valley might be coaxed to give up its flood a field at a time, how dead ground could be woken not in a decade but in a single turning of the seasons, how a seed saved from the strongest plant in the wettest year would breed children hardier than itself. Great houses sent for her for a few short years. The name Sennen meant abundance. Then came a run of black harvests, as they always come, and the men who had grown fat on her success grew frightened. It was easier to blame the woman who had changed the old ways than the weather that had always ruled them. She was called unnatural. She was called a poisoner of good ground. A bishop's court named her methods a meddling against the natural order, a kind of witchcraft. And though they could not hang a woman for draining a fen, they broke her as surely as if they had her patrons, melted away. Her writings were ordered burned. She died not long after, in a rented room, with her daughter beside her, and one thing left unbroken between them, a promise. For Oriel Sennen had done her finest and most secret work at a single unregarded holding, years before her name went dark. A flooded valley whose lord had let her attempt everything the great estates would not risk. She had drained one corner of it. She had buried her strongest seed there, against the day of the burning. And she had written all of it down, every measurement, every channel, every saved and strengthened grain, in a book she trusted to no house, but only to that ground itself. The holding was called Falomir. So when the Duke of Harrogate, wanting to be rid of an inconvenient poor relation and a worthless flooded scrap of land in one clean stroke, had offered Wenna the choice of any neglected corner of his estate to keep or to leave, he thought her simple for the eagerness with which she seized the very worst of them. He scraped its granaries bare, signed it over, and went back to his creditors. Well pleased, certain the fens and the empty barns would swallow her inside the year. He did not know that he had placed his own tenant's grave and her mother's whole life's work into the hands of the one person alive who could read it. That was Wenna's secret, and it was worth more than her life. If Crake so much as suspected that the keeper of Falomir was Oriel Sennen's daughter, come not to keep dead land but to prove her mother right, that beneath the standing water lay a system that could feed not one holding but a whole county, and a name waiting to be lifted out of the mud, he would have his letter to the Duke written before nightfall. She would be turned out, or worse, the ground would be sold from under her, and the last true copy of everything her mother had died for would go under the plow of some stranger who could not read a word of it. She had until the turn of the year, one spring, one summer, one harvest to raise the dead, and to do it beneath the eye of a man who counted everything, and a duke already counting the weeks until she failed. There is a particular cruelty in being guarded by the very man who helped to ruin you, and being unable to say so. Wenna had known Crake's face long before she came to Falomir. She had been a child of 11 the first time she saw it, in a cold stone room where a row of clerks sat writing down everything said against her mother. He had been younger then, less gray, but the flat pond-ice eyes were the same, and the tidy hand was the same. It was his ledger, irregular practices, and the monies wasted upon them that the bishop's men had read aloud, while Oriel Senon stood very straight and answered nothing. He had not been the one to call her mother a witch. He had merely reckoned the cost of her in neat columns, and let the columns do the hanging. He did not know that the grown woman keeping his master's dead holding was that child. Why should he? The child had been a Senon, and Senon was a name that had gone under with all the rest. To Craik she was only the woman, a poor relation the Duke had set down here to be quietly rid of, a nuisance to be managed until the year turned and the ground could be sold clear of her. But she knew him, and knowing him changed the shape of everything. The terms of her keeping were plain and merciless. At the turning of the year, Falomir must answer for its own debts. The arrears the Duke had let stand against it, the very sum his emptied granaries had been meant to cover. If she could not raise it out of the ground by then, the holding would be sold to clear the reckoning, and she would be turned out with what she could carry. And the drowned corner where her mother's whole life lay buried would pass to a stranger who could not read one line of it. That was the whole of her inheritance, a year, a fen, and a debt. From the first week, Craik set himself between her and the land. The Duke had left perhaps a dozen souls at Falomir, 2 ploughmen too old to be worth dismissing, a shepherd, a handful of cottagers' wives, a boy for the beasts, and Craik commanded them all, through habit and through the key he kept at his belt. For it was Craik who held the last of the stores, Craik who wrote down each measure of oats and each tallow dip, Craik who decided quietly who ate well that winter and who did not. He let it be understood, without once saying it aloud, that any hand who took the woman's orders before the bailiffs would find his ration reckoned very fine indeed. So when Wenna asked for 2 men to begin clearing the choked ditches of the lower fields, she was refused. The lower fields are drowned and will stay drowned, Craik said, not lifting his eyes from his figures. They have lain under water since before your time and mine. His Grace does not pay good labor to dig graves for a fen. The men will mend the upper walls and the roofs, so that what little we hold is not lost, and you will not send them splashing about in the mire on a woman's fancy. He dipped his pen. I keep the accounts of this holding. I will not have them read, at the year's end, as the accounts of a fool. It was said with perfect reason. It was a wall built exactly across the single road. She had crossed a county to travel. She did not argue. Arguing was a thing one did with a man who might be moved, and Craik was as movable as the ice. His eyes were the color of, she inclined her head and went away and thought, if no man at Falomir would set foot in the drowned fields, then she would go into them without a man. If the daylight belonged to Craik and his ledgers, she would take the hours that did not to gray before the yard woke, the last blue after it slept. And if she needed the strength of 10 men to open a ditch that 10 men would not open, there stood at the bottom of the yard behind a double rail a creature with the strength of 20 whom every soul at Falomir feared to touch. Everyone but her. That night when the cottages had gone dark, and Craik's window with them, she carried a lantern and a spade down to the lower gate. Bracken was awake, as he always was, a great gray shape patient in the dark. She let herself through the rail. He did not scream, and he did not shy. He lowered his head and breathed her in, and she laid her hand flat to the enormous warm slope of his neck and spoke to him, very low. The first plan she had said aloud to any living thing since coming to that place. You and I, she told him, are both here because they could not sell us and could not use us. Let us show them what that was worth. His ear turned to her voice and held there. But up in the sleeping house, a man who counted everything had already begun to notice that his accounts of the woman would not balance. She asked after the drowned fields too particularly. She looked at the worthless lower corner too long and too often. for someone the Duke had merely thrown away. Craik did not yet know what she was. He knew only that a sum was wrong somewhere, and Craik had never in his life let a wrong sum lie. Corwin, Count of Marrow, had not ridden to the river to look at a woman. He had come to look at the water. For 3 years his county had been sliding, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, toward hunger. The wet had come and stayed. Marrow's low fields soured, its wheat lodged and rotted in the ear. Its granaries, which his grandfather had built proud and deep, gave back each spring a little less than the winter had eaten. Corwin was a young man wearing an old man's burden. His father had died with the ledgers already tilting, and left him a name, a hungry people, and a horror of the day the last bin would ring hollow under the scoop. He was grave, past his years, sparing with words, and he had learned to look at his own land the way a physician looks at a patient he is losing, with love and with dread, and with a growing private certainty that nothing he did would be enough. He had tried everything a careful, modern lord was supposed to try. He had brought in a celebrated improver from the south, a man full of opinions and fees, who drained one marrow field in the fashionable way and flooded 2 others doing it, and went home richer. He had bought seed corn at ruinous prices and watched it rot in the cold wet ground. He had mortgaged a wood and then a farm, and then a good part of his own name to the money lenders of the county town, and still the water rose, and the yields fell, and the faces that came to his gate grew thinner through the winters. That last spring 3 families had asked his leave to go, to give up land their people had held 200 years, and try the manufacturing towns instead, because a town at least fed a man while it used him up. He had let them go because he had nothing to keep them with, and afterward he had ridden out alone and been sick behind a hedge like a boy, where none of his people could see their lord despair. That was the whole shape of the thing he carried. He had been raised to believe a lord was the roof over his people's heads, and he could feel the roof failing above them beam by beam, and neither his rank nor his learning nor his long careful nights over the ledgers could mend a single rafter of it. So he had grown quiet and grave and sparing with his hopes, for hope disappointed often enough curdles into something that shames a man to carry. What hope he had left he kept the way one keeps an ember in wet weather, banked and guarded and not too often looked at, for fear the looking might be the very thing that put it out. It had been a long time since anything at all had made him forget himself, enough to simply stop and stare. So he had little patience left for miracles, and none at all for the drowned scrap across the river that everyone called the worst ground in 3 counties. When his reeve came to him twice in a fortnight with the same strange tale, that the flooded corner of Falomir was somehow losing its water, that a light moved in the fen before dawn, that a monstrous gray horse had been seen dragging something through the reeds, Corwin had frowned and said it was moonshine and drink. But the reeve was a sober man, and he came a 3rd time. And so, on a raw morning, the color of pewter, the Count rode down to the far bank to lay the nonsense to rest with his own eyes. He did not lay it to rest. He sat his horse among the alders in the gray light, and forgot, for a long while, to breathe. Below him, where he had expected a sheet of dead water, the fen had drawn back from a long, dark line of newly opened ditch, and the standing flood was crawling down it toward the river, slow and certain, the way blood leaves a wound that has finally been unstopped. And in the field itself, hock-deep in mud, hauling against a chain fixed to a hurdle, piled with cleared brush and stone, was a horse. Corwin knew the horse. Every horseman in the north knew that horse or the story of him. The great gray colt bred at Marrow's own stud, foaled the year Corwin's father died, grown too large and too fierce for any man to back, sold at last for almost nothing because he would let no rider near him and answered to no one. Corwin had watched him loaded, screaming, into the dealer's cart with a boy's grief he had never confessed to anyone. He had thought the animal long dead in some knacker's yard. And here he stood, in a drowned field at the world's edge, leaning his whole vast weight into a collar as mild as a farm pony 4 winters broke, and at his head, one hand resting light on the gray neck, walking him on with nothing but her voice, was a woman. She was slight and plainly dressed, and mud to the knee, and she moved without any hurry at all, as though she and the monster and the water had all the time there was. When the hurdle stuck fast on her root, she did not shout or strike him. She stopped and set her hand flat to his shoulder and waited until the great muscles gathered of their own accord, and then the load came free with a sucking groan, and the water ran on a yard further to the sea. The ground does not flatter, his grandmother's saying, her father's before her, the marrow answer to every fine speech and every empty promise. You may lie to a man, the old people meant. You may charm a court and cheat a bishop, but you cannot flatter a fen into drying or coax a wild horse into harness with a pretty word. The ground and the beast answer to one thing only, and it is not birth, and it is not gold. It is whatever true thing you actually are. Whatever this woman actually was, the drowned field believed her, and the unbreakable horse believed her, and Corwin found that he believed them. He did not ride down. He did not call out. Some instinct he could not have named told him that to be seen would break the thing he was watching, the way a shout breaks the surface of still water. He only sat among the alders until the light came up full and gray, and watched a lone woman do, patiently and alone, the one thing all his lords and reeves and hired cleverness had failed for 3 years to do for Merrow. She was making dead ground live. At last she stopped to rest, and straightened, and pressed a hand to the small of her back, and looked up, across the river, straight at him. He had thought himself hidden. He was not. Their eyes met over the running water, and Corwin waited for what always came next. The servant's flinch, the dropped gaze, flustered curtsy of someone caught above her station by someone above his. It did not come. The woman did not startle and did not look away. She looked at him for the space of 3 long breaths, level and unafraid, a mud-stained stranger meeting a count as plainly as if they had both been born to the same rank of earth, and then, as though he were no great matter either way, she turned back to her horse and her ditch and her impossible work, and left him sitting there feeling, for the first time in 3 gray years, that he had been the one who was found wanting. Corwin turned his horse for home. He would learn who she was. And he knew, riding back, exactly whose door to knock at first, for there was one person left in Merrow who remembered every steward and scandal of the last 40 years, and who had never once been content to let a wrong sum lie any more than Craik was. He went to see his grandmother. The summons came 2 days later, and it put Craik into a temper Wenna had not seen in him before. It was a small, stiff note under the seal of the Dowager Countess of Merrow, carried across the river by a liveried rider who would not give it into any hand but Wenna's own. The Countess desired the keeper of Falomir to wait upon her that afternoon, and had sent a carriage to the boundary to spare her the walk. Craik read the direction on the outside twice, and his knuckles went white on the ledger. He was never without. "What business," he said very quietly, "has the house of Merrow with the keeper of a drowned field?" "None that I know," said Wenna, which was true, and told him nothing, which was the point. She went. Lady Audley received her in a long room hung with faded tapestries of harvest that Merrow no longer had. She was very old and very upright, dressed in gray silk, gone soft as ash, with a face like a fine map much folded, and eyes that had plainly missed nothing in 80 years, and did not intend to begin now. She let Wenna curtsy, and looked at her for an uncomfortably long time before she spoke. "Sit," she said. "You needn't stand on ceremony with me, girl. I have outlived ceremony, along with most of the people it was for." She waited until Wenna had sat. "My grandson tells me you have taught the ungovernable horse to work, and the drowned field to drain. He is a serious young man, my Corwin, and he does not marvel easily. You have set him marveling. The horse taught himself, your ladyship. I only stopped frightening him. The old woman's mouth moved, not quite a smile. And the water? Did the water stop frightening itself as well? Wenna said nothing. The Countess leaned forward. Let me tell you what I know, and you may keep your secrets under it. As long as you can, 40 years I have watched land in this country. I have seen fine lords who owned 10,000 acres and belonged to none of it, who took and called the taking husbandry. And once, a very long time ago, I saw a woman who owned nothing at all and belonged to every furrow she touched, who could stand in a dead marsh and see the corn that wasn't there yet, plain as you or I see a laid table. Marrow sent for her, once. In the years her name still meant abundance. She saved a valley for us that our own men had given up as lost. And then the weather turned, as it always turns, and the frightened little men who had never in their lives made anything but hunger decided it was easier to burn the woman who made bread than to admit the sky was not theirs to command. The old eyes fixed on Wenna bright and terrible. They called her a witch, and broke her and scattered her books to the fire. Her name was Oriel Senon. And you, girl, have her exact trick of going still before a thing you mean to master, which is a trick I have seen in no other living soul. Before this week, the room was very quiet. Somewhere a log settled in the grate. Wenna's whole life balanced on the next thing she said. To confess was to put her fate into the hands of a woman she had known for the length of one conversation. To deny it, to this face felt like spitting on her mother's grave a second time. I am the keeper of Falomere, your ladyship, she said at last. Lo, I am owed my keeping. Lady Audley sat back, and this time she did smile, though it was a sad and knowing thing, a careful answer. Your mother gave careful answers too. At the end, when careful answers could no longer save her, she let that sit a moment. Then her voice gentled. I will not press you, but hear an old woman who has nothing left to gain by lying to you. There is a difference, child, between what is fair and what is owed. Fair is what the strong hand out when it costs them little. Owed is what was taken and must be given back. A valley, a name, a mother's good repute. Your mother was owed a great deal by this country, and it died still owing her. Debts like that do not lapse. They wait for someone with the courage to collect them. Wenna's throat had closed. She had come into this room, a keeper of drowned ground, guarding one secret with her life, and in the space of a quarter hour, an old woman had walked straight through every wall she had built and named the thing at the very center of her, not cruelly, but the way a surveyor names a boundary that was always there. She had spent 14 years being no one in particular. It was a strange and frightening thing after so long to be seen. You speak of courage, Wenna managed, as though it were a thing a person might simply decide to have. It is, said the Countess. That is precisely what it is. Everything else is only weather. She rose with effort and crossed to a cabinet and took from it a single sheet of paper, brown at the edges, scorched along one side, covered in a close, clear, unmistakable hand, a page of measurements of channels and levels, and saved seed snatched from a fire 14 years gone. When they burned her work, said the Dowager, laying it in Wenna's shaking hands, not every house in this country stood by and warmed itself at the blaze. Some of us kept a page. When you are ready to be known, and you will have to be known, girl, before the year turns, or you will lose everything a second time, remember that you do not stand as alone as they have taught you to feel. The horse knows you. My grandson has begun to know you, and I knew your mother. Her folded map face was fierce with old shame and older resolve. That is, 3. It is enough to begin. The page Lady Audley had given her did not lie quiet in her apron. It burned there. For a week, Wenna carried her mother's scorched hand against her ribs and felt the year turning under her feet. The old Countess had spoken a truth. She had been hiding from herself. Patience alone would not save her. She could drain the field and gentle the horse and raise a crop from the dead corner and still lose everything at the reckoning if she could not prove who she was and what she was owed. And the proof? Her mother's whole life set down in her mother's own hand, and the strong seed, sealed against the burning, lay where it had lain for 14 years. In the deepest part of the drowned corner, under water, she had only begun to move. Then the sky turned against her. The old shepherd read the weather, the way Crake read a column of figures, and without being asked, he told her that a great water was coming. 3 days, no more. It was the great spate that came down off the high moors in the wettest years, and put the whole low valley back under flood to the hedge tops. When it came, the ditch she had opened would fill again within the hour. The corner she had half drained would drown to twice its former depth, and whatever lay buried there would go down beneath a fresh yard of silt where no spade of hers would ever reach it again. 14 years. Her mother's work had waited. It would not wait out the spate. She had one night the shepherd could promise her dry. She took it. She spent the daylight hours of that one dry day being seen to be idle, which was its own kind of labor. She let Crake watch her mend a fence in the upper yard, slow and dull, a woman resigned to keeping worthless ground until the year turned her out of it. She ate her supper in the servants' hall with her eyes on her plate. She let the boy see her bank, her fire early, and all the while she reckoned the thing she meant to do the way her mother would have reckoned it, coldly, in order against the risks. The risks were plain. If Crake found her in the drowned fields by night, digging where he had forbidden her to dig, it would be the end of everything. Proof for his letter, cause for her dismissal, and no lord in 3 counties would take the word of a turned-off maid over a bailiff of 20 years' standing. If the spate came early, she would lose the light and the footing both. And if she failed to find the chest at all, if all those years of shifting water had swallowed her mother's marks, then she would have staked a whole of her hope on a hole in a fen. But there was no version of waiting that did not end in loss. So she chose the risk that at least had a door in it, and when the dark came down, she went to the one creature at Fallowmere who would keep her secret, because he had no words to spill it. When the last cottage went dark, she went down to the lower gate, and Bracken came to her out of the black without a sound, and she led him into the fen. She carried the scorched page folded inside her shift where the wet could not reach it, and a shuttered lantern, and her spade, and a coil of rope she had begged from the boy. Her mother's directions were spare and exact, a surveyor's, not a poet's, from the drowned oak, 40 paces on the line of the old boundary, where the ground rings hollow underfoot. The drowned oak still stood, a black dead giant with the water round its knees, exactly where the page said it would, 14 years, and her mother's word held true. When a pace off the 40, the mud sucking at her to the shin, Bracken waiting patient behind her with the rope made fast to his collar, and at the 40th pace she stopped and struck her heel down, and the ground gave back a low, dull note, hollow as a covered well. She began to dig. The digging was slow and terrible. The mud fought her for every spadeful, and the water she had thought driven back came seeping into the hole as fast as she could empty it, so that she was soon working in a cold black soup that reached her elbows. But 2 feet down her spade rang on something that was not stone, and she went to her knees in the freezing muck and cleared it with her bare hands, the flat top of a chest, iron-banded, sunk in a bed of clay her mother had puddled tight around it against exactly this water. She got the rope beneath it. She stood and set her hand to Bracken's great shoulder, and spoke the word she used to ask him for his strength. But the chest did not want to come. Long years of settling had wetted it to the clay, and the rope she had passed beneath it bit and slipped in the wet. The first time Bracken took the strain, the loop slid off one iron corner, and the great horse staggered forward into nothing, near to going down himself in the sucking dark. Wenna went back into the freezing hole to her shoulders, and worked the rope round again, this time crossing it beneath both bands, and knotting it against itself the way her father had once shown her to sling a cask. Her fingers had gone past cold, into a clumsy faraway ache. She worked by feel, her cheek against the mud, the chest's edge, hard as a doorstep under her jaw. Somewhere off in the dark, at the very edge of hearing, a sound came and went, a long, low, formless mutter, like a cart crossing a bridge a great way off. She lifted her head. The night gave her nothing back but the drip of her own hands and the horse's patient breathing. A cart at that hour, in that place, was nothing. She had imagined it. She set her hand to his shoulder again and asked him, low, for everything he had, and he gave it. The muscles of that vast gray body gathered and swelled. The rope came up singing taut. The clay gave up its long hold with a reluctant groan, and the chest rose, streaming, into the lantern light, just as the mutter in the dark stopped being anything she could pretend not to hear. And that was the moment the spate came a day early. She heard it before she felt it, a long, low roar up the valley, out of the dark to the north, the sound of a whole night's rain on the high moors arriving all at once. Then the river, a stone's throw off, heaved its bank, and a wall of black water came down across the fen toward her faster than a horse could run. Let us stop here a moment while the water rises, and if these stories are worth the wait to you, subscribe, so the end of this one and the start of the next will come to you and not be lost. The flood took her legs from under her before she understood it had reached her. One instant she stood braced at the chest with her hand on the horse. The next she was down and sliding, the lantern gone dark and gone, the cold closing over her like a fist, the current dragging her by her heavy skirts toward the river and the sea beyond it. She had one thought, and it was not for herself. It was that the chest would go down and her mother would drown a second time, and then the water turned her over and she had no thoughts at all, only the animal scrabble for air. The rope saved her. The rope and Bracken. She had made it fast to his collar, and kept the coil looped once about her own wrist, and when the flood swept her past him, the loop drew tight and held, and at the far end of it, the great gray horse set his feet in the streaming mud and refused to move. He did not bolt. Every instinct in a horse says run from rising water in the dark, and every man at Falomir would have sworn on the book that this horse above all would run and drag whatever was tied to him to its death. He did not run. He stood, foursquare and screaming his fury at the flood, and leaned back against the rope with all his monstrous weight, and hauled her, inch by inch, against a current that wanted her, back out of the river's mouth and up onto the bank, until her hands found his sodden mane and she dragged herself, sobbing for breath, against the warm, heaving wall of him. For a long moment, she could do nothing but cling and shake and drag the freezing air into her, her face buried in the reek of wet horse, her legs still in the water that plucked at her like living hands. Bracken did not move away from her. He stood with his flanks heaving and his ears flat and his whole body braced between her and the flood, and every few seconds a great tremor ran the length of him, and she understood that he was as frightened as she was, that he had mastered the one thing every fiber of him screamed to do, and held and hauled. Not because he did not fear the water, but because she was on the other end of the rope. The horse no one had dared to trust, the one no man could trust at his back. He had stood in a rising flood in the dark and refused to save himself because saving himself would have meant losing her. "You great fool," she whispered into his neck, and her voice broke on it. "You beautiful great fool. They feared the wrong thing in you all along." Behind her, at the lip of the flooded hole, the chest sat half drowned with its rope run slack, and she would not let go of the horse to reach for it, and she would not let it go down, and so she stayed exactly where she was, caught between the beast and the burden, shaking and holding to both. She was still there, arms locked round the neck of the beast that everyone had feared and no one had wanted, when the other rider came out of the storm. She saw the lantern first, tossing wild as its bearer forced his horse down the flooded bank at a speed no sane man rode in the dark. Then she saw the man behind it fling himself down into water to his waist and come wading toward her, shouting a name. Not hers, she realized, but the horse's, the old Marrow name for the colt the county had bred and could not keep, and it was the Count. Corwin had been at his window when the spate came down. He had seen, across the black valley, one small light moving where no light should be, out in the drowning fen, and he had known whose it was, and he had not stopped for a coat. Between them, and by Bracken's terrible strength, they got the chest out of the water before the silt could take it. They dragged it up to the one high hummock the flood had not yet reached, and Corwin struck a light with shaking hands, and there, in the small, wild glow, Wenna knelt over the open iron chest with the rain running off her like tears, and lifted out, wrapped in oiled cloth against just this night, a thick book bound in dark leather. And beside it, a dozen sealed clay jars of seed, and a single letter with her own name on the outside in her mother's hand. For a moment neither of them spoke. Wenna knelt over the open chest in the rain with the book held in her two hands, and could not have said whether the water on her face was the flood, or the sky, or her own weeping. 14 years. 14 years since a borrowed room and a whispered promise, and here in her hands was the whole weight of everything her mother had been, not the witch the world had made of her, not the broken woman in the borrowed bed, but Oriel Senin entire. Her mind, her patience, her long, quiet war against hunger, that is taught in her own unhurried hand, and kept safe by the very ground she had loved. It had waited all that time for the one person who could carry it out again. It had waited for her. The seed jars were still sealed. She held one up to the small wild flame and saw, through the wax-clouded clay, the pale gleam of grain her mother had chosen kernel by kernel in the wet years and buried living against the fire. Not a relic. A beginning. Corwin looked at the book, and at the drowned field he had watched her raise from the dead, and at the wild horse that had just refused to run, and at the woman kneeling in the flood who had met his eyes across the river 3 weeks before and not looked away. And he understood, the way the ground and the beast had understood before him, exactly what true thing she was. Senin, he said. It was not a question. You are Oriel Senin's daughter. She was too spent to lie, and too far past it to want to. I am, she said, and this is her life, and if you mean to take it from me, my lord, you will have to do it now, while I have no strength left to stop you. But up the valley, where the yard of Falomir stood, on its rise above the flood, a light had appeared at Crake's window and begun, slowly and with purpose, to come down toward them through the rain. Crake reached the hummock too late to see the chest opened, and too soon for anyone's comfort. He came out of the dark with his own lantern high and his ledger. Even now, even at midnight, in a flood, that ledger, clutched dry against his chest, and he stopped short at the sight that met him, the drowned fields ribboned with new channels running the water off toward the river as they had not run in 14 years, the unbreakable horse standing, quiet under a soothing hand, the keeper of Falomir kneeling over an iron chest she had dug from ground he had forbidden her to touch, and, worst of all, the young Count of Marrow at her side, with his sleeves black to the shoulder, as though the two of them were partners in some long-laid scheme. His flat eyes moved over all of it, and reckoned it the way he reckoned everything, into a column of costs. I see, he said, and there was a cold satisfaction in it, digging in his Grace's ground by night, consorting with his Grace's neighbor, and keeping what? Treasure papers. He took a step nearer the chest, and Bracken's head came round. Low, and a growl of a sound started in the great chest, and Crake stopped. It makes no matter what. It is enough. A woman who cannot be trusted to keep to her own fields cannot be trusted to keep a holding. His Grace will have my letter by the week's end, and you, madam, will be gone from Falomir before the year turns, with nothing as you came. You mistake what is in the chest, said Corwin, and though he spoke quietly, the authority in it was a count's, and it made the bailiff turn. But by all means write your letter. Write in it also that you found the Count of Marrow standing witness to everything you saw. Your master may weigh his bailiff's word against mine as he pleases. Crake's certainty flickered, just once, like his lantern in the wind. Then it hardened, "As you like, my lord, the law is the law, and the debt is the debt, and no lord's word washes out a ledger." He turned and went back up through the rain the way he had come, and Wenna watched him go, and knew that the true reckoning had only been moved forward. They carried her mother's chest to Merrow that same night, because Falomir held not one safe dry corner that Crake did not hold the key to. And in the days that followed, while the spate ran itself out, and the whole low valley lay under water, all of it but the ribboned corner Wenna had drained, which stood clear and dark, and breathing above the flood, like a proof written on the land itself, the shape of an alliance formed in the long tapestried room at Merrow over an open book, for the book was everything. Wenna read it aloud to Corwin and his grandmother by candlelight night after night, and it was as though Oriel Senan sat in the room with them and spoke. It was not witchcraft. It was patience written down. It was the exact grade to cut a channel so the water ran but the soil stayed. The order in which a drowned field must be woken so it did not sour. The marrying of seed to strengthen seed across the wet years. The whole slow art of persuading dead ground to feed the living. It was, Corwin understood with a rising and almost painful hope, the precise medicine his own dying county had been perishing for want of. One night, Wenna turned to a page near the end, written in a smaller and more tired hand than the rest, and read them not a method but a kind of testament, something her mother had set down plainly for whoever should come after. The men who ruled the land, Oriel had written, had never once baked a loaf of bread with their own hands, and had come to believe that hunger was a law of God rather than a failure of care. They hoarded against scarcity and called it prudence. They let good ground lie drowned rather than risk the new and the strange. And the whole art she had spent her life upon came down in the end to one unwelcome idea, that abundance is not found but made by patient hands and belongs by right to the hands that make it. Corwin sat very still through that reading. When it was done, he said, "Lo, my grandfather built the granaries at Merrow to hold against famine. He was proud of them. And every full year he kept them locked and let the price climb. And every lean one he sold high to his own starving tenants, and called it the market." He looked down at his hands. "I have done the same. God forgive me, because it was what I was taught. A careful Lord does." "Then be taught otherwise," said Ottilie from her chair by the fire, not unkindly. "You are not the first Merrow to keep hunger in a locked barn, nor, if this girl has her way, the last to learn better. Listen to the book, Corwin. It is worth a great deal more than the barn. You could save Merrow with this," he said one night, very low, when the reading was done. "My mother could have," said Wenna. "I can try. But you have men, my lord, and seed, and stores to carry your people through one more hungry spring while the ground answers. I have a book and a horse and a debt I cannot pay." She met his eyes across the candle level as she had met them across the river. "You need what I know. I need what you have. Let us not pretend either of us is doing the other a charity. It was not how a servant spoke to a count." Corwin found he had never in his life so enjoyed being spoken to. So the bargain was struck, and it was a strange courtship conducted in mud. Through the long weeks that carried high summer into the gold of autumn, Merrow's men crossed the river to Falomir and to Merrow's own soured fields, and Wenna walked among them with her mother's book and taught them to cut the channels and set the levels and save the seed. Corwin worked beside her, not as a lord, watching labor done, but with a spade in his own hands, because he had learned that dead ground answers no man who keeps to the dry headland and shouts his orders at it. They spoke of levels and grades and the habits of water, and beneath every plain word another conversation ran, unspoken and unhurried, the way the freed water ran beneath the winter ice. A look held a moment past its business, a hand steadied on a slippery plank, a book left open at a marked page for the other to find. Neither named it. Both knew it was there. There was one evening she remembered long afterward. They had spent the day on the worst of the Merrow fields, a sour 12 acres that had beaten 3 generations of reeves, and by dusk they had cut the last channel of the first set and knocked out the plug, and stood together at the headland in the failing light to watch. For a long while nothing happened, and Corwin's jaw tightened in the old way, braced for one more disappointment. Then, with a small dark chuckle of sound, the standing water in the nearest furrow began to move, to find the channel, and slide, and run, and all down the field, one furrow after another, the flood woke, and went looking for the sea. Corwin laughed aloud, the startled laugh of a man who has forgotten he owns one. He turned to her, mud to the elbows, his grave face open, and suddenly young, and for one held breath, the whole small distance between a count and a keeper simply was not there. Neither of them crossed it. She looked at him and he looked at her, and then the moment did the wiser thing and became instead two people grinning like fools at a draining field. But she carried it home inside her coat like a warm coal, and she knew that he did too. "The ground does not flatter," he said at last, watching the water go. "You told me that with your eyes across the river, before ever I heard your name. I have thought of little else since, but Craik had not been idle either, and Craik had teeth. He had watched the carts run the wrong way, grain going out of Fallowmere and over the river into Merrow out of a holding that was supposed to be dying, and he had watched the Count's men come and go, and the woman walk among them like a mistress. And he had drawn from it the only conclusion a man like Craik could draw, that he was being cut out of something, cheated, made small. He cornered her once in the empty granary, in the grey of a morning, his ledger under his arm, and something new and ugly in the flat of his eyes. "You think you have won," he said, "a count's favour and a full cart. I have watched favour come and go at this house for 20 years, and I will tell you what outlasts it. The ledger, the debt, the law." He tapped the book against his chest. "His Grace does not care a straw who feeds Merrow. He cares what Fallowmere owes him at the year's turn. And what it owes him, madam, I have written down, and it is a great deal more than a woman and a horse can dig out of a fen in the days she has left." He leaned close. "I do not yet know what you pulled from the flood that night, but I will. I count everything. In the end, it is the one thing I have never once failed at." She let him say it, and gave him nothing back, because she had learned long ago that a still surface tells a counting man nothing. But she rode to Merrow that night, and told Corwin it was time to stop being gentle with the accounts, and it was that, as much as anything, that set Audeley's steward to reading. It was Audeley who found them. The old countess, who had spent a long life distrusting any account that came out too sweetly, set her steward to reading back through the Fallowmere accounts of the last 4 years. The very ledgers Craik was so proud of, and what he found there was the making of everything that followed. Craik had been stealing, not grandly. A careful man does not steal grandly. He had been shaving the stores for years, a measure of grain here, a fleece there, selling the estate's substance quietly into the next county, and writing the loss down as waste and blight and murrain. The same tidy hand, the same trick of a lying column that he had used on Oriel Senan 14 years before. And in the reckoning of it, a greater thing came clear. The crushing debt that hung over Fallowmere, the debt due at the year's turn, the debt that was to sell the ground from under Wenna's feet, a full third of it was Craik's own theft, dressed up in his own figures and laid to the land's account. The debt was a lie, the same lie from the same pen that had broken her mother. Wenna held that page a long time. It was not the theft that stopped her breath. She had always known Craik for a thief of one kind or another. It was the hand, the same narrow, tidy, merciless hand that had once reckoned her mother into the fire had gone on, year after quiet year, reckoning other people's bread into his own pocket, and had at last, without ever knowing whose daughter she was, reckoned a lie against the daughter too. The pen that broke Oriel Senan and the pen that would break Wenna were the very same pen. There was a kind of terrible symmetry in it, and, waiting inside the symmetry, a kind of justice, if only she had the nerve to turn it. Corwin laid the proof before Wenna with something like fury in his quiet face. "This ends him," he said. "This alone ends him. We take this to your duke, and Crake hangs for it." But Wenna sat a long while with her mother's book open in her lap and the stolen years reckoned out before her, and when she spoke, it was slowly. "Not yet," she said. "If we go to the duke with only this, Crake is a thief, and thieves are common, and the duke will find a new bailiff and press the true third of the debt, and sell my land regardless, and my mother will still be a witch in every mouth in the north country." She closed the book. "I do not want Crake caught stealing sheep. I want the whole of it undone. The debt, and the lie beneath the debt, and the lie beneath that, all the way down to the day they burned my mother's work and called it justice. I want it undone in front of the man who profits by it, and in front of everyone who watched me carry water and thought they knew what I was." She looked up. "Let Crake write his letter. Let the duke come. Let him come to Falomir thinking he comes to sell a ruin and turn out a fool, and let him find what autumn made of it." Corwin looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the night of the spate, he smiled, a slow, grim, admiring thing that changed his whole grave face. "He is already coming," he said. "Crake's letter did its work. His Grace of Harrowgate will be at Falomir within the fortnight to settle its accounts and its keeper with his own hand." He reached across the table, and this once he did not steady her hand on a plank or pass her a marked page. He simply took it and held it. "Then we have a fortnight, Wenna Sennen, to raise your mother from the dead." By the time the duke's summons was sworn to come, the reclaimed corner of Falomir had turned to gold. It was the thing Wenna had not let herself believe until she stood in it. A standing crop where 3 years of maps had shown only water, heavy-eared and sound, sprung from the drained ground and her mother's saved seed and one hard season's patient labor. It was not a great field. It was a corner, but it was more grain than the whole of Falomir had raised in a decade, and it came ripe in a year when marrow across the river had almost none, and so the carts that autumn ran the other way for the first time in living memory, out of the drowned scrap the Duke had thrown away, and over the river into the hungry county, where Corwin's people, who had begun to talk of leaving their homes, ate bread that season because of it. The woman the Duke of Harrowgate had left with empty granaries was, by the gold of that autumn, quietly feeding the Count. But the harvest was not the thing she had dug out of the fen. That still waited. In the long room at Marrow, in an iron chest she had not been able to bring herself to empty. She read the letter last of all, on the night before the Duke was due. It was short. Her mother had never wasted words on paper, any more than on a channel. "Wenna," it began. "Not my beloved daughter. Nothing so soft." Her mother had shown love in works, not words, and the plainness of it undid Wenna more than any endearment could have. "If you are reading this, then you have grown, and you have come back, and you have learned to read the ground, or you could not have found where I hid it. Good. Everything I know is in the book. It is not magic, and it was never magic. It is only attention, paid patiently, over years, to things too slow for frightened men to see. They will call it wicked because it frightens them that a ditcher's daughter saw what their fathers did not let them. The corn does not care what they call it, and neither in the end should you. The ground here is yours. The old lord set his hand to it, and the deed is under this letter. Keep it safe from the man Crake, who counts everything and owns nothing. Raise the field, raise your own life out of it, and do not, whatever they have done to us, become the kind of small, frightened creature that does such things to others. That is the only defeat that would truly finish me. It was signed only OS, the way she had signed her surveys. Wenna read it 3 times in the candlelight, and each time the plainness of it cut deeper. There was no farewell in it, no tenderness dressed in fine words, and that was the tenderness, the whole of it. Her mother had spent her last strength not on comfort, but on making sure the work survived, because the work was how Oriel Sennen loved. She had loved in drainage and in saved seed, and in a chest packed against a fire she must have known was coming. She had loved forward into a future she would never see, toward a daughter who was then a child of 11 and might have grown into anyone at all. And she had trusted that child to grow into someone who could read the ground and find the chest and finish what was begun. It was the last line Wenna could not get past. Do not become the kind of small, frightened creature that does such things to others. Her mother had written it without knowing the shape the temptation would one day take. But she had known her daughter, and she had known the world, and she had known that the ones the world breaks are so often the very ones who go on to break others and call it justice while they do it. Oriel had reached out of a 14-year grave to forbid it. Wenna folded the letter along its worn creases and put it against her heart, inside her dress, where the scorched page had ridden all those weeks, and understood that her mother had just decided, from the far side of death, what her daughter would and would not do to the man Crake when the hour came. Beneath it, as promised, lay the deed, an old grant under the seal of the late Lord of Falomir, the present Duke's own father, bestowing on Oriel Senan and her heirs, in perpetuity, and in payment for the reclaiming of his drowned valley, the very corner of ground she had raised. It had never been honored. When the world turned on Oriel, the old lord had let it turn, and quietly kept the land, and let the grant sink out of sight with the woman. And it was Audely's steward, in the end, who supplied the last and heaviest stone. Reading back through long years of records the old countess had prized loose from 3 counties' worth of dusty rooms, he found that after Oriel's ruin, the reclaimed lands she had made for the great houses had been bought up cheap, in the confusion of her disgrace, by one buyer above all others, the House of Harrogate. The family that was now coming to sell Wenna's ground for a debt had built no small part of its fortune on the ruin of the woman who made that ground worth having. Wenna laid it all out on the long table in careful order, the way her mother would have laid out a survey, the book, the scorched page, the false ledger, the forgotten deed, the record of who had profited. A whole life's injustice, reckoned at last into columns of her own. "Tomorrow," said Corwin quietly at her shoulder. "He thinks he comes to sell a ruin." "Tomorrow," said Wenna. "He learns what autumn made of it." And out on the road from Harrogate, in the first grey of the morning, the outriders of the Duke's carriage came into sight above the hedges. Osric, Duke of Harrogate, stepped down into the yard of Falomir expecting to find a graveyard, and found instead a harvest home. The yard was full. Word had run through both valleys that the Duke was coming to turn out the woman who had drained the fen, and both valleys had come to see it, Falomir's own folk, and the Merrow men who had cut the channels, and the cottagers' wives, and the children who had once been forbidden the lower yard and now sat along its wall for the view. In the middle of them stood the loaded carts of the season's grain, and the granary doors were open behind, and where the Duke's own memory held only bare swept boards, the bins now stood filling with the corn of the ground he had left for dead. Crake was at the Duke's elbow before the carriage door had shut, his ledger under his arm, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Your Grace sees the truth of my letters. The woman has meddled where she was forbidden, consorted with Merrow, endangered the estate, and cannot account for what she has been about in the drowned fields by night. The debt falls due today. I have the figures. She has nothing to set against them but excuses. He had, Wenna saw, dressed the whole triumph carefully, the way he dressed a column of theft, so that the plain facts pointed only one way. The Duke looked at the full carts, and the open granary, and the gold stubble running down to the river, where his map said there should be marsh, and a small frown of confusion crossed his handsome, indolent face. But he was a man, long used to letting Crake's figures do his thinking, and the debt was the debt. "Well," he said to Wenna not unkindly, for he had never thought her worth unkindness, "you have done more than I looked for, I'll grant it. But a corner of corn does not answer a debt 3 years deep. The accounts must balance. I am sorry for it." "Then let us balance them, Your Grace," said Wenna. In the open, before everyone who has ever wondered what I was. And she began to lay her columns down. She had Corwin read the false ledger first, Crake's own hand, the shaved measures, the sold stores written down as blight, the third of the debt that was nothing but the bailiff's theft dressed in tidy figures. The color went out of Crake's face by degrees as the count was read against him, and when he tried to speak over it, the Marrow men and the Fallowmere folk together hushed him, for many of them had gone short those winters and now knew where their bread had gone. Then Audley's steward read the record of the reclaimed lands, and how the house of Harrogate had grown fat, buying cheap the ground a ruined woman had made. And the Duke stopped looking indolent, and began to look, for the first time in his easy life, ashamed. Then Wenna spoke, the last of it herself. "You did not throw a poor relation onto a worthless fen, your grace. You put me on the one piece of ground in England I would have crawled to reach. For the woman who drained this valley the first time, 14 years ago, and buried her life's work in it against the day they burned the rest. The woman your bailiff there held to brick, with that same lying pen, the woman your father used, and then let the world call a witch, so that he might keep her lands cheap, was Oriel Sennen. She let the name fall into the silent yard like a stone into still water, and felt it, at last spoken aloud in the open air before them all. And I am her daughter. My name is Wenna Sennen. This ground was deeded to her heirs by your own father's hand. She held the old grant up, and the seal of Harrogate hung plain on it for every eye. And it was never yours to sell. There is no debt. There is only what was taken, and what is owed. It is a strange thing to be made real in front of people who thought they knew you. All that autumn, Wenna had been the woman, the keeper, the meddling maid, and now, in the space of one spoken name, she was herself in the daylight, and could never again be anything less. Something in her that had been holding its breath for 14 years let it go. The Duke of Harrogate was not a wicked man, only a careless one, and carelessness caught out in the open has nowhere to stand. He looked at the deed and the seal and the faces of 2 valleys, and he did the one thing left that a man might do with a scrap of dignity. He yielded whole, rather than be stripped piece by piece. Fallowmere, he acknowledged before them all, was Sennen ground, and had been these 14 years. The debt was a fraud and was struck out, and he would make what amends a shamed man could. Then he turned from the crowd, because a great man cannot bear to be watched being small, and went back to his carriage a lesser lord than he had come. That left Crake. He had committed frauds enough to hang, and every soul in the yard knew it, and for one long moment the old rage rose in Wenna, sweet and terrible, for this was the hand, the very hand, that had reckoned her mother into the fire. It would have cost her a single word to loose the law on him, or worse, the crowd. She looked at the man who counted everything and owned nothing, and she felt how easy it would be, and she heard her mother's plain voice off the letter. Do not become the kind of small, frightened creature that does such things to others. I could give you to the law, and it would take your life, she said to Crake, quietly, so that he had to be still to hear her. My mother would have had every right to it, but she made bread where you made hunger, and I will not close her account by becoming you. Your thefts go to his grace, to answer for as he sees fit. Your keys you leave at that gate. And you go from here, with exactly what you left my mother, your name, your 2 hands, and nothing else. And you live, which is more mercy than you dealt her. She turned from him as the Duke had turned, and did not watch him go. And that, more than any rope, was the end of him. Then into the silence, a child laughed somewhere along the wall, and a Marrow man began to load the last cart, and the great gray horse at the yard's edge put up his head and let out a long ringing call over the fields, and the reckoning at Fallowmere was done. A year on, there was no drowned corner at Fallowmere. There were fields. The whole low valley had been raised, not in the miracle season the frightened men had once feared and burned a woman for, but field by field, channel by channel, in the plain, patient way the book set down, until the water that had ruled the valley for a generation ran quiet in its ditches and did as it was told. The Granaries. The Duke had scraped to the wood, stood full to the rafters, and passed full, and the surplus went as it had gone that first gold autumn, over the river into Marrow, where the famine that had been 3 years in the making broke at last and did not come again. The county that had been on the edge of scattering stayed, and ate, and sowed, the new way in its own turned fields, so that the feeding of the count became in time the feeding of the whole county, and then of counties beyond it, as copies of a ditcher's daughter's book went out from Marrow into every low, wet valley that had ever been given up as lost. For the name Sennin had come back into the world, and this time it stayed. Audley saw to that. The old countess spent the last great energy of her long life making very sure that the woman who had once been called a witch was called, instead, by every agricultural society, an improving landlord in the north, the mother of the new husbandry. Her scorched surviving page was framed, her book was printed. And on the rise above the reclaimed valley, where the drowned oak had stood, there was set a plain stone with a plain line cut into it, in Wenna's choosing. She made bread where there was none. Wenna herself was no longer a keeper of anything but her own. She went in green and gray wool now instead of drab, and her hands, though still a worker's hands, were her own hands, doing her own work on her own ground. And she had come to hold herself in her room the way her mother had, still and unhurried and entirely unafraid. She was mistress of Falomir in her own right and name. And she was something rarer than a mistress. She was the one they sent for now, the great houses that had once sent for her mother. And she went, and she taught, and she never once let them forget whose knowledge it was. As for the men who had ruled her, the years dealt with them quietly, which is the only justice most wrongdoers ever meet. The Duke of Harrogate, shamed into decency, and finding it less painful than he had feared, gave up the false debt entire, and in a fit of late conscience endowed a school on the Marrow Road where the new husbandry might be taught to any tenant's child who cared to learn it. Men said he grew, in his last years, into something nearer the lord his people had always been told he was. Craik was never hanged. He was simply undone, stripped, dismissed, his frauds handed to the law to grind through at their own slow pace, and he ended his days as a clerk of accounts in a wool town far to the south, reckoning other men's money for a wage, a small, precise figure in a room full of larger ones, forgotten by everyone he had ever harmed. Wenna did not think of him often. That, in the end, was her revenge, and she found it was enough, for the deepest change was the one no one could see. The girl who had come to Falomir braced always for the next blow, guarding her name like a coal in a cupped hand, head unclenched. She had stopped waiting to be found out, because there was nothing left to find. The worst thing about her had turned out to be the best of her, and she had spoken it aloud in a full yard and lived. She slept the whole night through now. She laughed without first glancing to see who stood near. She had learned, slowly, the one thing her mother's book could not teach, and her mother's life had never been given the chance to learn. What a person becomes on the far side of fear, when the ground is drained, and the debt is paid, and the name is safe at last in the open air. Corwin had changed as much as the land. The gray dread had gone out of his face. He smiled easily now and worked his own fields with his own hands still, because he had never lost the habit or the liking of it. They had spent that whole year in the old strange courtship of shared labor. A look held past its business, a book left open at a marked page, a hand steadied on a plank that neither of them any longer pretended was only a hand steadied on a plank. He asked her on the rise, by the plain stone, at the turn of the second autumn, with both valleys gold below them. "I am not a quick man, Wenna," he said, "as you have had a year to learn. I do not rush the water, and I do not rush the ground, and I have plainly not rushed this. But I find I have run out of reasons to wait, and I never truly had any, but fear, the same fear your mother wrote down, of wanting a good thing too much to bear the losing of it. He took both her hands in his there in the open where anyone might see a count and a ditcher's daughter, and past caring who did. I am not asking the keeper of Falomir to come and be a countess at Marrow. I am asking Wenna Sennen, who owns her own ground and belongs to it, whether she will join her valley and her life to mine, not because either of us needs saving now, but because the work and the years and everything I mean to do are all better with you in them than without. She did not feign surprise, and she did not look away. She had never in all the time he had known her looked away. I have been drawing the channels between our two valleys in my head since the spring, she said. I only wondered how long it would take you to ask. He laughed, the grave Count of Marrow, laughing out loud on a hill, and it was answer and acceptance both, and he did not kiss her, because it was not their way, and never had been. He only held her hands, and looked at her with a settled and steadfast joy that needed nothing louder. And Bracken, who was never far from her, now Bracken, the terror, the unbreakable, the beast no man could ride, grown glossy and calm and gray as a friendly storm, who let the smallest Marrow children up onto his vast patient back and carried them at a walk about the yard. Bracken came up the rise to find her as he always found her, and put his great head down between the two of them where their hands were joined, and stood there over them, like something that had appointed itself their guardian a long time ago, and saw no reason to stop now. Wenna rested her hand on the huge warm slope of his neck, and looked at the man beside her and the valleys below, all of it raised together out of the same mud, the field, the horse, the name, the two of them, and understood that the silence her mother had died inside had finally been answered, not with noise, not with vengeance, only with abundance, patiently made and justly kept, and shared out at last to everyone who had ever gone hungry in its shadow.